Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the 7 Sage Law School Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Jake Vasca, 7 Sage Admissions Consultant and podcaster, and we're recording this right after the April LSAT returns have come back. Although with my jacket on, you would never know it. We're in a little bit of a cold snap here. But the April LSAT is where we really start to see the transition from people who are taking the LSAT to apply in this current admission cycle to people who are taking the LSAT because they want to apply in the upcoming admission cycle. So we know that we have a lot of new listeners tuning in to get ready for the coming application process, and hopefully they're excited because we know that this is the first LSAT for a lot of people, and seeing that score can lead to so many emotions. As someone once put it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. So if you're in that latter camp, that worst of times camp, we certainly feel you. Be kind to yourself and remember that it's normal to take the LSAT 2 or 3 times. We know that's not preferable on a financial or psychological or spiritual level, but it's okay. So, there's lots of time to get ready for the June, August, September, October, November, any or all of those tests. Okay, so go lick your wounds, do something nice for yourself, and then, hey, get ready to rock and roll all over again. But if you're in that former camp, it was the best of times. On Wednesday morning, you opened your email from LSAC, you saw that new score, and either you reacted with a, whoa, yeah, or at least a, okay, yeah, that's solid, I can work with that. The next logical question that we get from a lot of people is, so what do I do now? Should I get started with my applications? What's up with that? And so that's going to be the topic of today's podcast, getting rolling with your statements, most notably your personal statement and then your diversity identity statement. So we may also touch on a couple other documents. And then joining me to talk about this is Don Corrigan, who is one of our 7 Sage writing consultants extraordinaire. So Don, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jake. I appreciate it. This is my first podcast, so
I know, and I'm more surprised than anything that somehow we have not had you on before, because although I call everyone a 7 Sage consultant extraordinaire, like Don is on my short list of, sometimes when people ask, I really need someone who's really going to work closely with me, listen to me, help me through the process. Who can you recommend? And I'm like, oh, so-and-so, Don. Fantastic. So we're really happy to have you on today.
Delighted to be here.
But beyond that wonderful introduction I just gave you, hey, can you just take a moment to give people perhaps a more professional introduction on you and your background and what you do here at 7 Sage?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, in terms of the invite to the podcast, what immediately came to mind when you said that about, not being out here previously is I think of myself often as the Brent Spiner character in Independence Day. They don't let me out much. I'm back there, doing my work behind the scenes, but it is fun to be out here in front for a moment. So, again, I'm a senior writing consultant with 7 Sage. I joined 7 Sage, been with 7 Sage for 5 years, joined during the pandemic. Those were also interesting times. My background, like many, though not all of the 7 Sage writing consultants, I do have an MFA in creative writing. I focused on poetry, but I really, in terms of my own writing, kind of do a bit of everything, lots of prose, fiction, and nonfiction as well. That was, some time ago, after lingering around academia for quite a while and having a lot of fun with that. I kind of moved into the private sector, did some tech writing, worked in software for a while, then spent over a decade in local government, worked in affordable and subsidized housing, and that's what I was doing when I joined 7 Sage. What I and 7 Sage felt qualified me to do the writing consultant work is that I, in various ways, whatever my professional title was or official title was, I've just spent, a tremendous amount of time writing, editing, coaching other writers, whether that was in a professional setting or an academic setting. And I think my specialty sort of developed just out of my own writing quirks and interests really is the short form prose piece. Spent really over, decades really working in what's called flash fiction or flash nonfiction prose pieces of anywhere from 500 to 2,000 words, and got a real sense of what you can do in 500 words versus 750 versus 900 versus 1,200. And of course, that is the space of the law school admissions essays. Yep. So that's what I, kind of bring to our clients.
Don, I, as you were saying that, what came to mind was that actually for a volunteer thing I do, they've asked me for a little biographical material, and they're limiting me to 850 characters for a series of questions. So I'm like, yep. So I'm struggling with those. The flash nonfiction. I'm not making anything up for today's purposes.
Right. Nor am I.
No. Okay. Well, thank you for that background. And, so I think the primary question we get, or the biggest question at this time of year, is really vis-a-vis the personal statement. That's the big one on applicants' minds as they turn towards their documents. So let's just assume that you're having that first meeting with someone, that this person's at square one, and they may have some sort of idea about why they want to go to law school. I mean, clearly they've taken the LSAT, they've been doing all that preparation, but now they're pivoting away from that work into the actual application work. What are the first conversations you have, the first topics, brainstorming things that you do with them to help get them moving in this process?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is, of course, just initially a conversation. And really one of the first questions I often ask is, about their why law, why a JD specifically. And, of all the different things you could do, you're young. Well, we work with, of course, applicants of all ages, but, almost all younger than me, certainly. So y'all seem young to me.
A plurality somewhere in their mid-ish 20s.
Exactly.
But again, shout out to our folks who are a little older than that mid-ish 20s. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I love working with those applicants as well. But, we're working with people who are talented, ambitious, capable of doing a lot of things, accomplished. And so of all the different things you could do, and actually even of those applicants who have been out there in the workforce for a while and now are pivoting to law school, right? That's an interesting question too. So often they're people who are already flourishing in a career. What is making you want to really put yourself through, right? The 1L year, right? And then all that follows after that. Why is this the right path for you? And so we start just by exploring that. Seven Sage, of course, and I think this is, I feel like, kind of the rest of the world has come into, accordance with Seven Sage that the personal statement really does have to be your why law statement. And often, when I'm working with applicants, they do come with some knowledge of that. But I do find that often there's still an impulse to want to tell a more personal story, maybe something that is grounded in identity or childhood, et cetera. And we really have some, we spend a lot of time at Seven Sage with you, Jake, as our analyst. And then, we have a group of writers kind of analyzing, kind of success stories, kind of looking at what materials kind of really perform well. Because as I say to my clients, our job is not just to give you best practice advice, but give you best practice advice for the current moment. Because in law school admissions, at least in my observation, as in almost everything in life, it would probably be too trivial to say there's fads, but there's certainly trends over time, right? So our job is to make sure you are doing the right thing to, land you the best results and chances of success right now. And right now, the personal statement, should be focused on the why law. And again, there's kind of that general knowledge of that, but there's still also that impulse to, I think, just simply the label personal statement, right? It feels like it should be very personal. It really is. It really is. Statement of, Harvard changing it to statement of purpose is actually useful.
Exactly. If it was called professional statement, for example, that'd be a little bit different. But personal seems to mean you want to learn about me and the inner tickings of me, which is actually a different document that we'll get to.
Exactly right. And so that's, often, when I'm getting started with the client, I'll talk about that. And so my presentation, and I'm glad that we're in today's session talking about both the personal statement and that statement of perspective or identity statement, because really what I've come to feel is that the two of them work together, to tell the complete story of the applicant and to assuage, those applicants' concerns that, I have this really personal story that I need to tell. The answer is absolutely you're going to tell it. It's just that you're not going to tell it in the personal statement. You're going to tell it in that other document. And so sort of how I explain that is the personal statement, they are both about the applicant, right? The applicant is both the narrator and the main character of those essays. They are autobiographical in a sense, but the personal statement is like the applicant's professional autobiography or their intellectual autobiography. It's about where their career and professional interests lie, what the key experiences they had that led them, to determine a particular professional path is the right path for them, how they want to use those talents and abilities they have to solve particular problems or do a particular kind of work, right? So it is about you, but it's your professional self, your intellectual self. The statement of perspective is that more intimate of the two in terms of like, who are you at your core? Sometimes I explain the two and how they work together as a pair to my clients by saying the personal statement is about your, again, kind of your intellectual acuity, your cognitive acuity, what you think about, how you want to use, again, your abilities in the world to have an impact on the world. Your statement of perspective is almost your EQ statement, your emotional intelligence statement. It's about who you are, but also how you interact to others. And there's room for both in the application because really almost all schools have, a few schools have it required, that statement of perspective. But even those that don't require it, almost all schools have an optional essay where that statement can come in. So I find it often reassures applicants to know, okay, I'm going to be able to tell that more personal statement or more personal story, but we're going to do it, in this other document.
Yep. Well, and you touched on something that I feel like a lot of folks it's one of the big foundational questions as we begin this process regarding the amount of background or exposition that's expected. And so I'll put it to you this way. You mentioned needing to give some background in order for your audience to understand why they want to go to law school. As you're helping people at the beginning stage of this process, or maybe this is a more advanced thing, you don't worry about this at the beginning, but in general, how do you balance or coach people to balance background exposition with this also not becoming almost like a resume checklist thing? Like, I did this and then I did that, which led me to doing this, which is leading me to law school, and here I am.
Right. That's a great question because many applicants have heard of, right, the dreaded resume rundown,
Yep.
resume rehash. It has different names. And
Yep.
a good thing, I think, is everyone seems to know, or almost everyone seems to know, oh, I shouldn't do that. So when I start talking about, okay, we're going to look at your background and your life experiences, and of course the experiences that did lead one to determine a JD is what I need, law school is where I'm headed, a legal career is my destiny, as it were. Sometimes they do arise out of personal experiences, of course, right? Or a mixture maybe of personal experiences plus study, plus for those applicants who have some work experience or internships, plus, some of the experiences out of there. So when I start talking about, okay, we're going to look for some anecdotes or stories that are building blocks that kind of show this progression towards, you realizing this is where I need to be. This is what I need to do. Sometimes they'll caution me, okay, that sounds okay, but I've been told, kind of don't just do a resume rundown, right? Excellent caution, excellent concern. So the way I explain that to my clients is it's, I think of it, the word I often use is curation, right? You're curating, you do have to tell some specific anecdotes or tell me about certain specific moments. But it's not going to be a resume rundown because it's not going to be just I did this, as you said. That's exactly how I described a resume rundown. I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this. I find that some applicants, also there's sometimes a tendency, there's an impulse, and I understand this impulse, to want to do I think of it like as a subset of the resume rundown. There's a version of that where it's I did this and I did this and I did that and I won this award and that award. There's a real desire for some applicants to, in the personal statement, focus on moments where they've been acknowledged, right, for good work or for an academic achievement, accolades. The personal statement is not a list of your accolades. Those are going to be on the resume, and the admissions reviewers will see it. So now it may be that one of the moments you choose to highlight in the personal statement was a moment where you were acknowledged for something. But I think just as often it's a moment where maybe you ran into a difficulty or you learned a lesson, or something didn't go the way you hoped. But it can be any mixture of those. The selection process, though, the curation process these were the key moments, right? And it's a highlight reel because these are very small canvases, these essays. You've got 2 pages, 2 double-spaced pages. It's not a lot of room. That's part of the difficulty of these essays. I often, my clients now and I often talk about the fact that if I had 5 pages, it would in a certain way be easier, right, to achieve the goal here. How do I tell this compelling story about myself in such a small canvas? That comes, back to that whole kind of what can you do in 750 words or 900 words. But the curation process is that each of these moments that you're choosing to highlight is selected because it's clearly a bead on this necklace but it's not a necklace, I guess, because it's not a circle, right? It's a journey story. You're going forward. Exactly. We've unsnapped it, undone the clasp. Although sometimes, thematically you might circle back around at the end to kind of.
That's one of my rudimentary tricks, because I find that's really hard for me to conclude matters. But if you bring it back to the introductory anecdote, that provide, it's a bit of a crutch, admittedly, but it's only a crutch if you do it a lot of times. And thankfully, I'm not a published author, so I don't need to worry about that.
Right.
About people saying like, "Oh, Jake, he's so derivative. Like all he does is the same tricks over and over. Like I'm Dan Brown or something, ending every chapter on a cliffhanger."
Right. Exactly. Same template over and over again.
Yep.
But if, for the applicant, of course, it's okay, right? Because you're doing that personal statement once. So
exactly.
And maybe you'll do something slightly different in terms of how it's structured in the statement of perspective. So we'll show that kind of, rhetorical and stylistic variety.
Yeah. Well, and back to that notion of building block moments too. What's interesting about that is that harkens back to probably a lot of us when we were in high school English. So for me, I remember my sophomore year English teacher, that was the first time someone had actually helped us as a class, helped me as a student figure out how do we actually break down stories, books, narratives. And her big suggestion that stuck with me is look for those moments when the plot really changes, when you find these contraction moments where you feel like all the pressure's coming together and then it expands out from that moment. Those are probably really important moments for the author. And in our lives, as people who are slightly older than the median law school applicant, we can reflect back on our lives and probably point to a couple of those moments to say, those were those important moments. And so for our listening audience, it's good to start reflecting on those. You don't need to give me the resume recap, but what are a couple of those key moments? Because those are probably also not only good for your personal statement, they also usually lead to good opening anecdotes potentially, to really set the scene. And on that note, so okay, you've maybe had a couple brainstorming sessions, and now we're starting to actually put things together, whether that be in an outline or just blocking things out. How do you coach people to start to conceptualize that? So we've done the brainstorming, we've ID'd some things. How do we actually, it's like getting the ingredients together before you start cooking, but now how do we actually start that cooking process?
Right, exactly. And that's exactly right. And I do think, in terms of the brainstorming, I'll just touch on that for a moment, because that's part of what we do. Although we're not going to end up with an essay that's a resume rundown, we do start with the resume in the sense of the past experiences. And so the brainstorming I do with my clients is often, let's interrogate your past experiences. Let's look at everything you've done, the various jobs or internships you've had or volunteering work you've done. Your extracurriculars, anything you enjoy doing. Let's have you look at that and start telling me some stories about that. My guidance to my clients is always, I don't want you initially, in brainstorming, of course, it's always all yes, no, right? Just like improv, right? There's certain rules, don't censor yourself, because you may be closing yourself off from some interesting possibilities. So anything that occurs to you, jot that down. Don't worry. And also I tell them, I don't want you thinking in terms of a personal statement right now, because if you are, again, the censor is going to show up and say, oh, that doesn't make sense, or that's no good, or that's not interesting enough.
That's where I always found it problem at journaling is really hard, because you're immediately, even though it may just be for you, you're immediately thinking, but what if someone opens this someday? And so how do am I being honest myself, or am I, anyway? Yep.
Still picturing that reader exactly.
Yeah,
looking over
even
my
though the
shoulder.
Reader's just me, but yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, but there's always that possibility, right? Journals do end up being published, so your fear is real,
Yep.
Jake.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So we start with that brainstorming, and I just ask my client, the applicant, to tell me some anecdotes, and then we start looking at them. And what I look for is just, where does there seem to be energy in that initial writing, and where am I seeing, and I think some of the other writers do it differently, but where do I see the writing start to come alive? Where do I see, the applicant start to sort of go beyond just telling the story to kind of start making those connections, like that, oh, here was a moment, as you said, there's moments that your English teacher taught you to look for. And of course, one of the fascinating things about life and about literature, sometimes those moments aren't the ones that appear big on the surface, right? Sometimes they're small or quiet. Sometimes they're even internal. And that's something I tell my clients, that some components of the personal statement might just be you thinking about things. Now, I don't think the whole essay can be that, but some of it may be that, and that's okay, right? Sometimes us thinking deeply about things and having a eureka moment or an aha moment, right, does affect our trajectory. So I just we start looking through together what they've produced. And I am immediately starting to think in terms of like stringing those beads on the necklace. What are some pieces here that I can see where even if they're two disparate moments in time, the lived experience of the applicant, or they wrote in at different spots, but when I put them together, I see, okay, there's momentum building here. There's a theme starting to build. This happened and then this happened, and you didn't put them together yet. But when I put them next to each other, I see, okay, something's starting to happen here. Something's starting to cook. And so we just start working on outlining. The progression is, of course, brainstorming to outlining. And I'm just looking for interesting moments, moments that seem authentic, that do have energy, where I feel like, okay, the writer, the writer is showing up here, their personality is showing up, their excitement about ideas and things are showing up. And we start stringing those together. And then we look at, of course, because, there's going to be gaps. So then we look at, okay, how do we fill in those gaps? How do we truly bring these things together so that we have a cohesive narrative by the end?
Yeah. Well, and that's really, I like how you're putting this too, as you're looking for the energy. Because one category of problem I sometimes run into when I'm trying to help folks write out statements of interest or statements of perspective, college statements for undergrad admissions purposes, is this notion of, even from the beginning of our conversation, I don't feel like I have a unique story to tell. I don't feel like, how do I stand out?
Right.
So, okay. And that may not necessarily be, I would argue that's not the goal of this document, is not inherently to stand out, but also you may not feel that in those little moments. So, and I imagine this is one of your common issues too, is either at the beginning of this process, I'm not special, or at some point when you're drafting things out, someone may look at those moments and say, gosh, I'm explaining why I want to go to law school, and I want to go to law school because I'm interested in policy, but surely so many other people are about that. How do you balance that conversation of, but you seem really energetic about this, and okay, but I hear what you're saying regarding everyone wants to feel like they're the most unique snowflake in the world, the best
Right.
one that's fallen from the clouds. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that is something, I experience a lot with my clients. And one of our AO colleagues at Seven Sage said to me a couple of cycles ago, we were working with a client together who had that concern, that sense of just inadequacy, that I'm not enough of a unicorn, and it's kind of sweet. It's almost sad sometimes that, some of my clients will say to me, like, nothing interesting has happened to me, or I've had, I've had relative privilege, or, even just comfort, like that, nothing bad has happened. And so therefore I have, kind of nothing to write in these essays. So of course, none of that is, I'm glad if that is true of your lived experience. But, none of that means that, kind of you can't write an excellent essay. So what our colleague said to me that was helpful was, we're not looking for unique, we're looking for authentic. And so that's, kind of, I spend a lot of time with our clients. And that's one of the pleasures for me, is just helping our clients see, or, applicants see, that your story is worthwhile and interesting too. Each, something we used to say to each other in writing workshops is, only you can write your book. In other words, even if it's another murder mystery, right? And there's like literally a billion of them.
But I want more. I'm about to get on an airplane, and that's what I want to read for the next 2 hours.
Exactly. No one can write the one that you can write.
Exactly.
There's a billion sonnets, but they're still worth writing. And those are the kind of analogies I often, bring.
Yep.
The sonnet form has not been exhausted yet, and neither has the personal statement form.
Somehow, some way. Well, and on that note of unique story, that may be a good opportunity to pivot into that identity statement, optional statement, statement of perspective, diversity statement that you've already riffed on a little bit. But that's where I really face a lot of roadblocks with people, because I think many people look just at the term identity statement or diversity statement, and a certain number of people look at that term and go, oh, I've lived a life of privilege, or, oh, based on who I am, I don't think admissions wants to hear about me, to which I always offer, hey, the goal here is just to get to know you, okay? But then I think the second challenge is usually the things that would be good to write about are so ingrained in us that we don't understand that it's actually important to us. So anyway, walk me through that brainstorming process. Okay, so, and again, for our audience, optional identity statement is probably the most common optional document on a law school application. Everyone's going to require a personal statement. Every school is going to require a personal statement. But the most common optional statement is going to be some aspect of, hey, tell us about who you are. I always love Michigan's question here. How has the world you came from positively shaped who you are today? And since I'm talking with you, should it be how has the world you came from or how has the world you come from?
How is the world you?
Every time I read that, I want to say, how has the world you come from positively shaped who you are today?
What's the world you came from? No, I think past.
Boo! No,
I'm
Don,
sorry.
don't agree with them. Don't tell me I'm wrong.
Sorry.
Oh, man. Okay. Shout out to Michigan. Well, I've been making fun of you for many years for that prompt, but I'm man enough to admit when I'm wrong. It's okay. Okay. Anywho. So, okay, Don. So where do you have those initial brainstorming sessions on that statement? How do you get people past those initial roadblocks on that optional identity, diversity statement of perspective?
Absolutely. And I love the way you're referring to it because I do the same thing with my clients. I'm like, it has many names. It's the essay with many names. It used to traditionally be called a diversity statement. And I think there are maybe still a few schools hanging out there with that label. But of course, in the aftermath of the Supreme Court affirmative action decision, people have moved away from that label. And honestly, what I tell, my clients is even before, 2023, in my observations, many schools had started to move away from that. Now, we do, of course, want to say that any applicant who has those sorts of stories to tell, whose perspective statement is a story of overcoming adversity, and who maybe did experience disadvantages because of, coming from a marginalized community or, socioeconomic, status, et cetera. Absolutely, those stories are still welcome by the law schools, and it is your story.
And for those folks, we not only want to say that, but we also want to say it is your choice if you want to share that, because some people feel like it may be trauma trolling, which I absolutely get that. So if they want to share a different story, that's okay too. But yeah, we absolutely want to make sure in the Supreme Court Students for Fair Admissions decision, they actually point blank said, admissions officers can consider where someone comes from and issues of race, identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, if they write about them. So, but yeah. So I didn't mean to interrupt, Don, but I just wanted to hammer that point home for our audience. Like, not only are they still welcome, but also you have the option of choosing something else to write about if you so want to.
Exactly, and that raises a good point. Something I say to my clients often is that I think. For many clients, once we start really interrogating their why law, the direction of the personal statement comes into focus, right? Sometimes people do have, two interests that may seem, at odds. Like, for example, the applicant might want to go into corporate work, but also has a very strong impulse towards pro bono, wanting to do some kind of service to the community. And those things can be combined in a legal career, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that would be something where if you had a 5-page personal statement, you probably could talk really nicely about both. But 2 pages, you
got to focus down. So that's the personal statement. And it comes into, once we do that interrogation and exploration, it comes into focus. But I think when you talked about, the perspective statement, it can be more challenging. I think one of the reasons for that is something I say to my clients often is really, once we've done some brainstorming and I've learned about them and their background, there's probably 3 or 4 different statements of perspective you could write. I think for many of us, that's true because there's many elements that contribute. If we think of I like the label perspective statement. If we think about what shaped our key perspectives, right? For some people, maybe there is that one aha moment or eureka moment. But for many of us, it's a combination of things. And it may come from family, and it may come from community, but it also may come from activities we participated in, right? For athletes, it might come from the experience of, kind of being on that team, of going through those practices. For a musician, it might come from, it can come from many different sources. So, that's something we talk about, that there's many different possible stories here. And so we need to narrow down to one that makes the most sense, that feels most authentic to you, and that is going to best complement the personal statement to give those readers the holistic picture of you. So to answer your question, when I'm speaking to an applicant who maybe still sort of has, those remnants of the idea that, back when these essays were a diversity statement, that they were really meant for people who came from adversity to have a chance to tell their story. And I actually tell my clients, I think it's very sweet, actually, and I think it speaks to their integrity that some applicants who came from relative comfort feel like, oh, I don't want to encroach on a space that's not meant for me. I think that's I think that's lovely, actually. But so I reassure them, and I think you do the same, that even before, again, 2023 Supreme Court decision, many schools had started to broaden their prompts and used language like lived experience or statement of perspective. Again, inviting those who have adversity stories that they, as you pointed out, wish to tell those stories, but also making it clear that everybody has stories about, who they are at their core, what their core values are, and how their perspectives were shaped. To help clients overcome that reticence or that sense of maybe this is a space where I don't belong and I don't want to appear, that I don't want to step on the toes of those that this essay is meant for. I point to the fact that there's some schools like Harvard or Vanderbilt that have that essay as a requirement. And I actually love the fact that some of the schools have made it a requirement, because nothing sends the message more clearly that all of you are invited to write this essay because you have to.
We want to get to know you,
exactly.
applicant, as opposed to just learning about your professional aspirations. Who are you contextually? Absolutely.
Exactly. So to help select, because again, many people, might have more than one topic they could choose for this essay or more than one approach they could take. For me, the perspective statement, and again, I often, we think of, or I certainly think of the personal statement and the statement of perspective as a set, that almost a yin yang that together are forming the composite, complete picture of the applicant. So when I'm talking about one, I often refer back to the other. So for me, if the destination of the personal statement, and it is a journey story, and its destination is not just law school, but looking beyond law school to provide some sense of a vision. Doesn't have to be a precise job title, but some vision of what are you going to do after law school, right? We want to know that you have some ideas about that, because we want to know that you're certain that you need a JD as opposed to, say, a master's in social work or a PhD in history or international relations. So the destination of the personal statement is not just law school, but looking beyond it to, the applicants, at least a brief vision of their possible future career, showing them moving in that world as a legal professional. In contrast, the destination of the statement of perspective is law school itself, because if you look at how those prompts are worded, they do want to know who are you, what your values are, but their concern is, the wording is often, how are you going to contribute to our community? And the contribution here is not primarily an intellectual one. It's like, what kind of person are you going to be? What kind of student, classmate? And some of the prompts do include, kind of legal professional. But again, they don't mean what kind of law are you going to practice. They mean, what kind of colleague are you going to be? What kind of alumni are you going to be? Are you going to be this great, nice person who has a flourishing legal career and comes back on alumni day and, kind of mentors our, current students and speaks to prospective students? What kind of community member are you? So it is about who you are and what your values are, but it's also, how have those values shaped your interactions with other people? How do you think is the right way to treat other people? And so I find this is an essay where I think it is useful to start at the end. If we know that that's the question that you have to answer, if I admit you as the, admissions reviewer, if I admit you to our class and you come here, what kind of community member are you going to be? And how did you learn to be that kind of community member or team member or teammate? If we start with that destination, it often helps us come into focus about which might be the most strategic and also most authentic and interesting story to tell.
On that note, one of the most common questions I get regarding the phrasing of those questions. So, for example, just to read from the good book itself, I'll read from Harvard's prompt for their statement of perspective. The admissions committee makes every effort to understand who you are as an individual and potential Harvard Law School student and graduate. Please share how your experiences, background, and or interests have shaped you. And usually I stop right there because I want people to really focus on that. And also because I worry about this back half of that prompt and will shape your engagement in the HLS community and the legal profession. So just to get your 2 cents on that, how direct do you think, or how explicit do you think people need to be with that side of the equation? Meaning, what am I going to bring to this community? I'm kind, I'm empathetic, I'm willing to participate on karaoke night, right?
Exactly.
Versus how much do
I'm
we
a
want to
great
leave
pitcher,
it? I want
if
to
you
leave
want to
it
go to UVA.
implicit, right? So to understand me, one must understand my love of karaoke, and how that has shaped me through my life, and just leave it implicit. Like, oh yeah, by the way, if you have a karaoke night, I'll be jumping in on that.
There. Yeah, I don't think I agree. It doesn't have to be that explicit, but I do often. I mean, one of the exercises I have my clients complete to help them write this essay is picture yourself in that classroom. And I suggest to them, think of yourself that this is what the admissions reviewers are thinking about, right? They're putting together a community with each 1L class. They're putting together a community, and that community is going to. Those are going to be your ride-alongs, of course, for the 3 years of law school, but really for the rest of your life, right?
This is your primary professional network.
Exactly. So and we know that law school admissions reviewers, oftentimes my clients are interested in diversity, and I mean that not in the narrow way that sometimes the public discourse defines it, but in every way possible. Of course, all the traditional markers of diversity: race, ethnicity, skin color, religion, gender, sexual orientation, geographic region, political leanings, but also, I've already started to spill in some of the ones that people often don't think about, a variety of ages, work experience. I think for most schools, there's a few, exceptions that really just want, one type of applicant in terms of public service, but almost all schools, certainly sometimes applicants come to me and they want to do corporate law and they think that's something they have to hide, they only want public interest statements. Absolutely not true. The schools want to bring together students a mixture of interests, those who are interested in corporate law, public service, criminal law, so they want to bring together this group that truly is diverse, right, and has just a diversity of background experiences, which is part of what you're telling them about in that statement of perspective. But they want to put you in, so you're going to put you all, you're not mostly going to be all in one room together, of course, right? You're going to be in smaller classrooms, but really you're a group, you're a set, you're moving through life together. And they want you to be nice to each other. They want you to, you don't always have to agree. And I tell my clients, you want to be a law student and a lawyer. They expect you to have strong opinions. It's not that you're not opinionated, and it's not that you're unwilling to express your opinions, but there's a way to do that in a way that's courteous, that allows space for other opinions. And so think of yourself in that classroom, let's say it's orientation on the first day, right, with the room full, and left to, are you, somebody sitting next to you whose identity and background are vastly different than yours, and also on the other side as well. How do you feel? How are you comfortable? Are you excited to meet these new people and kind of make them part of your world? And so I find I do use the exercise of picture yourself, at orientation with this group, and think of, and of course the answer does seem obvious, as you said, that you're kind, that you're, you're comfortable, that you're willing to kind of meet people different from you and hear about their experiences. But, if we look at how the world works, that unfortunately is not always true of everyone, right? So they're just, it's a check, right? It's a kindness check. But as you say, you demonstrate that, by a certain amount of showing, not telling, in terms of the anecdotes you choose to tell.
Well, and Don, as you were explaining, how can you demonstrate that you can both disagree but get along with people? Don, did you also grow up in a boisterous family that was very loud at the holidays and still managed to love each other? That's sometimes the analogy I use for folks, is like, it's all the people at the Thanksgiving table were related and yet have very different opinions, and yet we still put down the opinion. We offer the opinions and then we put them down and we hug each other, and it's all, we come together there.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, okay. So that's one big question, but perhaps the other big question that I get with diversity statement, personal statement, especially the combination of the two, you've mentioned, you think of them as a package deal. Sometimes for some people, those two packages are too close together. So for example, what do I want to do as far as being a lawyer? I want to work in immigration law because I come from an immigrant community. And so I have to explain that background in order to have you understand immigration law. But now as I'm turning towards that statement of perspective, how has the world I came from positively shaped me? You have to understand I'm from an immigrant community. I've grown up in this enclave of people from the home country. Or what do I want to do professionally? I want to work on civil rights law because I am a student. I'm a person of color, a student of color. I've had these experiences. I've seen friends and family have these experiences. And now on the statement of perspective, how has the world I came from? You know what I mean? So how do you walk people through that process when sometimes these two topics are pretty close together?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And this is, we at Seven Sage, every cycle we work with at least a few reapplicants. And I will say this is something when we work with reapplicants, of course, we ask to see the materials they used previously. And this is something I see frequently, not all the time, but when I look at the sample, or not the sample essays, the essays they actually used in the previous application cycle, it's something we see that the personal statement and perspective statement just hew a bit too closely together. And that, of course, is something I've learned, Jake, from you and our other, AO colleagues, because I didn't know. I don't, I start, each kind of new working relationship with my clients by saying, I know you know this because you've seen the Seven Sage model, but I'm just going to put it out there. I'm not a former AO. I've never rendered a decision. I did not have the unhappiness of taking the LSAT. But I'm going to ride along with you. But I've learned a great deal from my AO colleagues, and I do know what is effective in these essays. And so that was something, that I learned early on. If the AOs like some kind of confluence, right, where things feel like they're molding together to tell a cohesive story, but they do not like repetition, so we can't just have, variations of the same essay. So that is something, absolutely we explicitly discuss. And this goes back to what I said, fortunately, that, most applicants really could write 3 or 4 different versions of a statement of perspective. So if I see that some aspect of their identity or, if it is a situation where, as the examples you gave, that the impetus to pursue a JD and a legal career arose out of certain key lived experiences and identity, and that is part of the personal statement, and I think that's working very effectively, I will suggest, let's pick something different for the statement of perspective. Let's explore your hobbies, or, I don't know, your travel, or, then we'll look to maybe even to the resume, like, what other things that you do, right? Because, nobody is one note or one dimensional, and we'll choose that, for the perspective statement.
Mm-hmm. And on that same note, and this may be a similar answer, another struggle for a subset of people applying to law school is that they really have to explain something on the Addenda section of the application or the character and fitness section of the application. And for those people who just took the April LSAT, and this is the first time you're listening or watching this podcast, first of all, welcome, like and subscribe. Feel free to come on back for the next episode and all that good stuff. But just to define these things, the Addenda section of the application is the miscellaneous section. Is there anything else that you feel like you need to explain for us to understand your application? A classic example being, hey, you'll see that I've taken we would obviously be more formal than that, but you will see that I've taken the LSAT 3 times and I went from a 150 to a 151 to a 171. Here's the context of that score increase. Or you'll see that I was a 4.0 student freshman year, a 3.0 student sophomore year, 4.0 junior, 4.0 senior. Here's what happened sophomore year. For character and fitness, you'll be asked questions akin to what you're going to have to address on the bar application, which is, have you ever gotten into any criminal trouble? Have you ever gotten into any academic trouble and or behavioral issues at any academic institution? A lot of times, if someone's why law originates in issues of adversity, challenges, overcoming something, sometimes that manifests itself too in that addenda or character and fitness section. So similar to personal statement, diversity statement, wanting them to play well next to each other, what about, gosh, the origins of my interest in law is when I was arrested, right? So how do we balance that between brainstorming for a personal statement and then also keeping in mind you're going to have to explain this on the character and fitness portion of the application in the case of that one example?
Right. No, that's a great question and a great point, because again, we want convergence and confluence in a sense of, kind of everything working together, but we don't want repetition. So for my clients who, we do recommend writing one or more addenda, or who have to, if they do have those character and fitness issues, and sometimes even if it's not a CNF addendum, if they are writing, say, like a GP addendum, we talked about, like, okay, we see on my transcript. There was one semester, something happened, right? If that's something that happened was, sometimes it has to do with, personal or familial circumstances. There was an illness in the family. Suddenly you were drawn into certain responsibilities, that you didn't have previously. That is content that even if not in your examples, Jake, right, that there could be kind of overlap between the addendum and the personal statement. But, those personal circumstances potentially could be overlap between an addendum and the statement of perspective. But again, we don't want to simply be telling the same story. So often what I'll do if we see that my client needs one or more addenda, we'll start drafting that, around the time, sometimes even very rarely. Sometimes clients come to us and they have, often it is a CNF issue, but sometimes it is just maybe a GPA they feel doesn't reflect, their real capabilities, and that they are worried is going to be an impediment to achieving, their goals in terms of school ranges. Rarely, but I will sometimes start with the addendum, mainly to assuage the client's, if I can see that there's so much anxiety about that issue that it's hard for them to
just get it out of the way,
immerse themselves. Let's just do that first. I find that it psychologically, it kind of lifts a burden to see it kind of there neatly on the page, less than a page. Sometimes an AO has looked at it and approved it, and it just kind of, there's an ability to be like, okay, I have to tell that story. There it is. It's on the paper. It doesn't look so terrible. Now I can, my mind is clear and I can focus. So sometimes we'll do that. But even if not, if we start to explore the addendum, and I find, as you say, that there's a personal story there, we will sometimes draft that alongside the statement of perspective or even do it first to make sure that, because again, there's a certain amount of material that each applicant has. There's certain stories that have to be told. There's certain stories that are advantageous to tell. And we want to make sure we're using all those components strategically to put together an application package that is cohesive, but not repetitive or redundant. So sometimes we will knock out that addendum first and then cycle back to the statement of perspective.
Yeah, that's a bit akin to, like in baseball, people talk about how pitchers usually throw fastballs first and then you throw curveballs, but some pitchers work better working backwards. Throw the curveballs first and then. So generally, I agree with you. Like, it's great to start with your personal statement because that's the most important document. Begin with that why law, get that squared away, and then the rest of it's easy peasy. But for some people, and if you're listening to us and I'm going to have to write these documents out, it can be really beneficial. Just start backwards. Start with those guys, and then once you determine that, what did I have to say on the character and fitness? And then if this is part of my personal statement, my why law, I know these two documents are going to build together. One may be the more factual, here's what happened, while the other is the more narrative, here's how this has shaped me side of things.
Exactly.
Okay, so Don, so for our new audience, just to give them an insight into when they're actually filling out the application, when you're putting this all together, your personal statement, your resume, you're filling out the application, etc., eventually it generates a single PDF, the application PDF, and that's the document that the admissions officer reads. And as an FYI, you as the applicant, before you submit this application, you can download that PDF and you can review it. You can see the exact same file that the admissions officer is going to see. What we find professionally is that the majority of admissions readers go through the application form first because those are they just go through the PDF. So the first couple pages are the application form, and then you hit either the resume or the personal statement, just depending on the school. And then you hit those diversity statement, optional statement, addenda, all that. But we find that some people scroll all the way down to the resume first, or they scroll to look at character and fitness first, or they scroll and read the personal statement and then loop back to the application form. So sometimes applicants have this question of, how do I make sure that any of these documents could be the right entry point for an admissions officer? I know this is like 4-dimensional or 5th-dimensional chess, right? So part of the answer here is probably take a deep breath, calm down, don't worry about it. But Don, how do you advise folks who think that each of these documents has to be that entry point? Well, what do you think?
It's a great question, Jake. And actually, it does happen. Most applicants are going to apply to, several schools, of course. And when they're building those PDFs, which I will just say, just a kind of PSA for everyone, Jake mentioned that when you're applying, you can download that PDF and review it. And let's just say you not just can, you should,
You should. And then you should save it. You should save it because you're going to have to submit that on your bar application a couple years from now. So save it somewhere where you are going to have that file in 4 years' time.
Download it, save it, but also we know that the desire to push submit is going to be so strong. You've been working for so long on this, but pause, review it, download it, don't submit immediately. Go for a walk and then come back and look at it. Maybe have someone you trust just take a quick look, before you submit.
Quality control check. Yep.
Exactly. Very important quality control check. Make sure you didn't, kind of include a different school's name in that YX because you've kind of used, wrote one and then used the template, et cetera. Just for your own peace of mind. Because I know from experience, if you don't do that, and then even if there's a small typo, that is not going to have any impact whatsoever. If you find something that seems amiss to you, you're going to feel months of stress. So save yourself that anguish, which is probably unnecessary, but we don't want you to feel it anyway. So, but to answer your question, Jake, and so when my clients are building their applications, sometimes they're disappointed to find, for example, if it's a school that has multiple optionals and they've written them and they feel like there's a particular order that is, more optimal, kind of more pleasing, right? To read this one first and this one. And then they upload them and into LSAT and the LSAT kind of scrambles the order. Sometimes they're sorely disappointed about that. I really wanted to end on this note. And of course, the other thing is even if the AO isn't, paging through, scrolling through that PDF willy-nilly as in your scenario. Some schools actually do present the order of the documents differently. Some schools start with the resume. Most start with the personal statement, but not all do. I've seen some that start with the addenda if an applicant has addenda. So my advice is just there can be an impulse because I think we've touched on this, or we've at least hinted at it, but I'll just say it explicitly that it is a good idea and certainly something we work on carefully at Seven Sages. You want your application materials, all of them, the resume, the personal statement, the statement of perspective, any addenda you have, and any optionals. We haven't really touched on optionals, but if you're writing YX or if you're writing another optional that a school has, some of them have kind of fun ones. We want all of them to knit together to create a cohesive picture of you as an applicant, and that is something we work on with our clients. But we've already touched on, we want them to knit together, but not to be repetitive or redundant. But also, you do want, because, the admissions readers, at least this is what I've discerned from, listening carefully to Jake and my other AO colleagues, they'll start an application and then they'll be interrupted and they'll get up and go walk away from their desk and come back and start reading again. So you do want them, regardless of where they are in your application, to be able to read each essay and understand it. So, for me, that's really simple. Some applicants because they want to create that sense of knitted togetherness, will refer back to their other documents. So they'll start a YX and they'll say, as I said in my personal statement. So my advice is don't do that. Cut out those references to the other documents. Make them work together because of the stories you're telling and the writing that you're doing, not by just kind of don't ask the admissions reviewer to go look at another document to understand what you're saying, because again, they're busy.
They're put together in different places, quickly. And yeah, exactly. Okay, so hey, Don, how about let me get you out here on this question. What do you think, and from your experience, are the one or two biggest roadblocks that folks face when they're at this stage, the brainstorming, initial outlining, initial drafting stage? What are the biggest roadblocks, and what are ways that they can get around those barriers?
Absolutely. So the biggest one I think we've already touched on, which is just that sense of wanting to write something, wanting to be a unicorn, and there's so much pressure on these pieces of writing, especially the personal statement. I think that pressure is daunting for people. It does produce a kind of form of writer's block, which we writing consultants are very familiar with. So you have to find ways to remove that pressure from yourself and not think about, kind of if this isn't just right or if this just is just right, you just have to produce the best piece of writing that you can. So something I say to my clients again and again is your inner critic is showing up. Tell them to go take a nap.
Your inner critic is your worst critic for the majority of us.
Right. We don't need that inner critic to show up for weeks, if ever. So just tell them to go take a nap. We don't need them. So don't be daunted by focus on yourself, not on, you read some personal statement online from somebody who had this, kind of extraordinary journey and you're daunted because that's not your journey. Fortunately, that's not what admissions reviewers require. They don't require you to have, to have a story that's cinematic. They just require you, again, as we talked about earlier, to be authentic and to be detailed and to give, kind of to put that camera on yourself close up and to really let them see who you are and what you care about. And if you do that well, even if you feel your life has been relatively quiet, I've seen again and again applicants with those kinds of stories written well, where they really show their, their concerns for the world and their deep interest, to have excellent success, kind of to achieve their goals in terms of the schools that they want to attend. So tell that inner critic to hush and go take a nap. I also, we very much at when I was onboarded at 7 Sage, part of why it felt comfortable to me is 7 Sage believes in the iterative writing process. It's the only process I've ever, well, not only, if I waited on inspiration to strike and kind of a perfect piece of writing to form, it's not that I wouldn't have any, but I'd have maybe 3. And at this stage in my life and career, that would be very disappointing. For me, iterative writing is the way that, great writing is achieved.
And what is iterative writing for our audience?
Iterative writing is many drafts. You're not striving for perfection on the first draft. You're barely even striving for a draft. You're just getting words on the page initially. And again, you're telling the inner critic, all yeses, no nos. Get all your ideas down. Then, yes to everything. You're going to write more than you need initially. That's something else. That's another tip. You've got in mind that you can only, that you have a 2-page canvas on which to tell your story, but in the initial writing, you're going to write a lot more than that, and that's good. Having too much material or a lot of material to sort from is not a problem at all as a writer. It's the best kind of problem to have, which means not a problem at all. So write a lot, explore all your different ideas, do it freely. Again, we know that you're high-performing individuals and you want things to look good the first time, but you can't worry about things like style, grammar, syntax initially. You're just getting words on the page. That's the start of the iterative writing process. Then you go back to the beginning and you read what you wrote. You say, what's here? What's interesting? Where's the energy? Where am I seeing some stories, as I talked about earlier, that maybe I never previously put together, but now when I look at them on the page, I see, oh, this moment I had earlier on did, kind of lead to this other moment, that both of which are steps on my journey to law school. So, kind of just spend time with your writing, start to select the pieces, produce an outline. You're still in that outline phase, not worried about style or grammar or syntax. You're just getting a shape. And that's part of the iterative writing process as well. And then you start just, start at the top, read through what you wrote. When edits occur to you, make those edits. When I'm working with clients, I'll say, I will put margin comments or just, tell you my ideas or put some red lines because I'm not the writer. I'm your writing coach. You're the writer. So if a change occurs to you, make that change. That's part of the iterative writing process. Confidently make the change. Work your way through, go back to the top and read again. And the iterative writing process means you do that again and again. And if you do that and trust that process, the writing will take shape and come into focus and it will turn into something beautiful.
And for our listening audience instead of our YouTube audience, as Don was monologuing there, I was just smiling and nodding because these are the things I need to tell myself when I'm writing. Yes. And also,
me too.
As you're explaining that, I'm thinking of the Peter Jackson Beatles documentary from a couple years ago, where they're recording the Let It Be album, and so much of what I got out of that is they didn't really come to the studio with songs. They were just like, Paul's just over there strumming a guitar, and all of a sudden he figures out, oh, that sounds good, and that becomes Get Back. And
exactly.
It's like,
they're noodling around.
If it's good enough for those guys, I mean, it's got to be good enough for me, right? Okay.
Good enough for us. Absolutely.
Exactly. Well, hey, Don, thank you so much. And for our audience, I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap up for today's episode. So again, a huge thank you to Don Corrigan for joining us today and for talking with us about what to do at this stage in the writing process as you've gotten your LSAT back and you're starting to pivot into those documents. For our audience, thank you as always for listening and watching, and be sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, we wish you all the best on your law school applications and as you navigate the law school admissions process.